So I was working on this video and, researching this topic is very heavy and there's like existential dread of making a video about something like this and putting it on the internet. And so I decided why not take a break and go see a play. And I know that the Manhattan Theater Club is really great. This is related, by the way, I promise. They have really cool, more politically spicy plays and a very reliable $30 ticket program for young people. So I grabbed a last minute ticket to see a play I'd never heard of called Eureka Day. And I was like, it's gonna be great because it's Manhattan Theater Club. And the play was about anti-vaxxers at a school that was like a social justice-based school that was too crunchy for its own good. And it was incredible. Definitely recommend, but was not a break from this topic and actually changed how I'm gonna make some of this video. So we're gonna talk about that later on. In the meantime, if you're new here, hi there, hello, how's it going? I'm Sydney, pronouns are they, them. We talk about disability-related things on this channel. For friends who need it, I'm a white young person with light brown shoulder length, longer than shoulder length. I need to get it cut. Curly hair, wearing a green button-up shirt that is 3/4 sleeves, but you can't see that. And I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. Today we're going to be talking about the whole autism and vaccine situation because it's politically relevant again. Yay! I want to preface this by saying that I am not a doctor and I am thus not qualified to be giving any medical advice. These are just the opinions that I've come to based on the meta-analyses I did of all of the research at hand, and I think it's important to have it explained in a more accessible way because that is a huge part of the problem with this in the first place. I've linked all of my sources in the description below if you want to read everything for yourselves, but I do hope that I've done an adequate job in collating what I can in this format for you. The other thing that I want to say before we begin is that this is a topic where emotions tend to reasonably run quite high, and there's a desire from both sides to call the other side crazy. And while factually anti-vax arguments are all incorrect, we're going to talk about that today, that does not mean that the people who believe those things are stupid or bad people or that the emotions they feel about those things are wrong. It means that our education system is garbage, social media is wholly unregulated, and our trust in the government and medical systems is virtually non-existent. And we'll get to the politics of that later as well. The crunchy to alt-right pipeline is alive and well. But I think this defensive desire to just call the other side names rather than have a conversation about how neither side feels like their needs are being met and figure out where disconnects are and how those can be broached is kind of sort of how we ended up where we are today politically. Because hatred and fear are really great political motivators because they cause such strong emotions that lead people to grasp onto the them group and stand for the this is the one that I am in very strongly, but it's not super great when it comes to the whole critical thinking thing. Not everybody who believes misinformation is a conspiracy theorist that cannot be deprogrammed. They might just simply not understand and not feel heard or seen and feel defensive about being told that they might be incorrect about something. All of which to say, hey, don't be mean in the comments. I don't have any tolerance for that, and if y'all can't handle this video, I will make it Patreon only, and that will be sad for everybody, so let's all be grown-ups around here. Our story begins in 1998. It actually dates way back, way before then, but we'll get to that. Bear with me. On the 20th of February in 1998, a British gastroenterologist, which means a person who studies the digestive system, and surgeon with a special interest in inflammatory diseases named Andrew Wakefield, published a paper in the fancy medical journal called The Lancet. This study by him and 12 co-authors basically suggested the MMR vaccine, which stands for measles, mumps, and rubella, led to an increased risk for autism in children. Specifically, that there's too many viruses in the vaccine at once for some children's immune systems to be able to handle, and so the measles one in particular causes a new inflammatory bowel disease that sort of causes autism that he called autistic enterocolitis. So to summarize, the vaccine can cause a special kind of autistic bowel brain syndrome that he discovered, and supposedly the participants in his study all developed the disease and autism concurrently less than a month after receiving the MMR vaccine. And I love that everybody just points to the whole MMR causes autism narrative when it's infinitely more convoluted in this original paper. Like, how do we ignore that this dude tried to create a new disorder that did not catch on at all, the aspect of this study? I get why the vaccine situation is objectively more important, but I feel like the argument of, yeah, science also doesn't support the disorder he tried to create, it's not just the vaccine-specific stuff he was wrong about, might actually help convince vaccine-skeptical people of the flaws in the study to some degree. I'm also curious if the somewhat, hesitancy is not the word I want to use, but there's like not as much discussion around the link between IBS and autism as there is hypermobility and autism or other things that link with it, and if that is directly tied back to people not wanting to associate at all with this research in this latest. I don't know. I digress. The paper was published in 1998, and then Wakefield did a press conference about it that was then followed by a huge media firestorm. The press found the perfect story: the victims, the children of the parents, the villain, the pharmaceutical industry profiting from the vaccine, and the conspirators, the scientists helping the government to hide the truth from the public. The Guardian, the Daily Mail, the New York Times, USA Today, the Washington Post, CNN, and CBS 60 Minutes interviewed devastated parents who had witnessed their normally developing child regressing into autistic behavior soon after being injected with the MMR vaccine. In an attempt to provide balanced reporting, the media gave equal exposure to scientific evidence and opinions. And every parent wants to protect their kid, of course, so of course people are paying attention to this. Also, Wakefield is a really charismatic guy, so it all worked out quite well in his favor. In the year 2000, a Republican congressman from Indiana named Dan Burton, who had an autistic grandson, held a congressional hearing to ask the Department of Health and Human Services to look into this study. Meanwhile, in the scientific community, almost immediately after the original study was published, everybody is scrambling to try to disprove this man as fast as they possibly could. In the meantime, Wakefield went and published another paper in July of 2002, doubling down on the autism-measles connection with a paper published in the Molecular Psychology section of Nature. And this one's really fun because he doesn't specify whether the kind of measles he's referring to as being present in autistic children was the measles virus used in the vaccine or the one that just is naturally around in the population at the time, which is a very important distinction, and there was an ability to test which of the strains it was that he just did not do, nor did he mention that he did not do that in the paper. They also used a hypersensitive detection method that rewards false positives, something also not mentioned in the paper. It also was not a blind study, which likely caused significant bias in the reported findings. 2 years later, in 2004, an investigative journalist named Brian Deer published an investigation in the Sunday Times. Brian Deer is an icon. Most of his work is around investigating medical and pharmaceutical issues, and for a while, it seemed like his main life goal was to single-handedly take down Andrew Wakefield, and my goodness did he succeed. What a legend. Anyway, he uncovered that Wakefield had been hired by a lawyer 2 years before publishing his initial study named Richard Barr, and Barr was working on an upcoming class action lawsuit about vaccine damage, representing families who claimed that vaccines had harmed their children and wanted Wakefield as an expert witness, which is a massive conflict of interest when it comes to what should be objective research, but this is how they found their funding as well as their specific cherry-picked participants for this study. But don't worry, we're gonna unpack the messy science, if you can even call it that. That was the original study. I'm getting there. As a result of Deer's discovery, 10 of the original 12 co-authors retracted the interpretation of the paper, which is functionally the conclusion of the paper. We wish to make it clear that in this paper, no causal link was established between MMR vaccine and autism, as the data were insufficient. However, the possibility of such a link was raised, and consequent events have had major implications for public health. In view of this, we consider now is the appropriate time that we should together formally retract the interpretation placed upon these findings in the paper according to precedent. At this point, the General Medical Council launches an investigation. It also comes out later this year that Wakefield held a patent for a measles-specific vaccine, which would suggest that maybe he would have wanted to have research exist that suggested an issue with the MMR vaccine to turn people into using his single disease vaccine instead. Again, a conflict of interest. The GMC Fitness to Practice panel first meets about Wakefield's case in 2007 and comes out with a final ruling in January of 2010. In 2009, Brian Deer reports in the Times about how the results of that original 1998 paper were fixed and manipulated. We'll talk about that later. The GMC panel rules that Wakefield has been dishonest and abused developmentally disabled children. A few days later, The Lancet retracts the paper, admitting that several elements in the paper were incorrect, contrary to the findings of the earlier investigation. Wakefield et al. Were held guilty of ethical violations. They had conducted invasive investigations on the children without obtaining the necessary ethical clearances, and scientific misrepresentation. They reported that their sampling was consecutive when, in fact, it was selective. This retraction was published as a small anonymous paragraph in the journal on behalf of the editors. I also did not know where to put this quote, but I feel like it should go somewhere. Even more absurdly, the General Medical Council, the UK's medical regulator, found that he had paid children at his son's 10th birthday party to donate their blood for his research. That's just weird. I don't know, I just needed to include how strange that is. Anyway, 3 months later, in May of 2010, Wakefield loses his license to practice medicine. In January of 2011, the British Medical Journal posts a series of articles written by Brian Deer about the specifics of how Wakefield faked and altered data. It also uncovers that after the deliberate popularity of this study, Wakefield intended, along with the father of one of the boys in the study, to create a new company called Immunospecifics Biotechnologies Limited that would create a diagnostic test for the new bowel disorder along with vaccines and immunotherapies, and anticipated making millions a year off of selling diagnostic kits. Can you say conflict of interest? Also, let's talk about the study. So, to begin with, there was no control group, which means there's no way of knowing if anything could have been causal or coincidental. It also relied primarily on the recall and beliefs of parents of the children in the study, which, as we know by how he found these families in the first place, is going to be a super particular bias. 3/4 of the parents of the children already blamed the vaccine for their children's developmental disabilities, but all of them began to blame the vaccine many years after the supposed onset of symptoms had taken place, so the timeline may have actually been quite different. Also, many of these families lived 100 or more miles from the hospital, which further suggests that they were cherry-picked. The assessments themselves themselves were not taken blind, nor were data collected completely or systematically, not to mention that every single case had misreported and altered information in it. Intestinal symptoms were observed after the autistic traits in all of the cases, implying that the intestinal issue could not have caused the autistic traits. Some of these children had pre-existing developmental issues before they received the MMR vaccine. Many of the children's symptoms were changed or left out altogether of the study. It was found that most of the children's colons were largely normal, but the results and records were then later changed for publication. I should also mention that the study was not a study in the sense of like collecting lots of data and putting it on graphs and running statistical analyses, but instead a case report. And a case report is basically just detailed stories about the medical histories of different cases and then making some conclusions off of that, which is one of the least scientifically solid kinds of papers because it primarily is just sharing anecdotal evidence. The other thing, I think the most important thing about this is that the case report only had 12 children in it, 11 of whom were boys and one of which was a girl, which is way too small of a sample size to really be useful for anything. According to the paper, 9 of these children had regressive autism, meaning that autism that seems to appear later with a regression in previously had skills rather than a slowed or altered development from the beginning, and 11 of them had a non-specific colitis. But when Brian Deer looked into this, he found that only one child clearly had regressive autism. 3 of them didn't have autism diagnoses at all, and 1 of them had an Asperger's diagnosis, which at the time was not autism, and also 2 of them were brothers, which is important information to have and was not noted anywhere. Wakefield neither replicated his findings nor apologized or admitted to being wrong. He instead moved to the United States, claims persecution by the medical authorities, and makes a living giving speeches on the anti-vax circuit and publishing books. But to the medical community, he is a complete fraud. Since the initial 1998 study, truly more studies than I can count, involving literally millions of children across many different countries and continents, have been conducted that have found no link between the MMR vaccine and autism. I linked an article at the top of the description that lists a bunch of different studies throughout it and how they all worked and what they all said, if that is a helpful resource for you. But truly, this research is so incredibly extensive. It is genuinely astonishing and amazing to me. I did not realize how much research there truly was. One particular kind of study that I found most interesting that I wanted to mention are called home movie studies, where scientists went through footage primarily from children's first birthdays, so before they would have gotten their MMR vaccine, which, if you don't know, there's 2 doses of that. One is typically given between 12 and 15 months, the other between 4 and 6 years. And they found that autistic traits were visible in children long before the parents suspected anything might be different and long before their first dose of the MMR vaccine. It is unclear to me whether these studies are the reason we know that subtle signs of autism can appear in early infancy or if that was already a known thing before this, but I do think it's really cool either way. But if you're looking at this like I was and thinking, okay, why do these parents think that the MMR vaccine caused autism in their children before this study came out if this is the seminal study about that argument? Because I thought that Wakefield started this whole conversation. But turns out there's a really long history of vaccine hesitancy. The very first vaccine was the smallpox vaccine. It was created in 1796 by a guy named Edward Jenner. Smallpox was declared completely eradicated in 1980. It is the only known human disease to have been completely eradicated, which is really darn cool. Vaccines are great. But in the early 1800s, smallpox was killing lots of people. So Jenner wanted people to get immunized because he created an immunization that was helping people to not get sick with smallpox, but a lot of people didn't trust medicine in general, and especially not Jenner's ideas about how disease is caused and how it's spread, which, in all fairness, if we're in 1802 and somebody's going, hey, I'm gonna take a version of this disease that's killing a lot of people and I'm gonna put it in you and then you're gonna become unable to get sick with that disease, particularly at a time in history where we didn't know about germ theory yet, I'd be a little skeptical too. That is, to be clear, not a reason to be skeptical now because we know a lot more than we did back then, but for 1800s people, I do get it to some degree. Many also thought the inoculation was unchristian because it came from an animal, but the thing is, it was really working, and smallpox is kind of a big problem. So the 1852 Vaccination Act was passed requiring inoculation for infants, and the Act of 1867 extended that age up to 14 years and added penalties for refusal. Many people believed that the government making it mandatory violated their personal liberty, leading to many protests, the most famous of them being the 1885 Leicester Demonstration March, which had between 80,000 and 100,000 anti-vaxxers at the march. This led to the creation of a Vaccination Study Commission, which in 1898 decided to remove penalties and create a conscientious objector clause to the guidelines. Across the pond over here in the US, the Anti-Vaccination Society of America was founded in 1879, as well as the New England Anti-Compulsory Vaccination League in 1882, and the Anti-Vaccination League of New York City in 1885. In 1905, the United States Supreme Court ruled that states are allowed to enact compulsory vaccination laws to protect the public against communicable disease. In 1927, the United States Supreme Court ruled that anyone has the right to involuntarily sterilize a person deemed feeble-minded, which has never been overturned and is still enacted daily in this country. That has nothing to do with vaccination. I just like to remind people that that law exists whenever I possibly can. In 1955, there was as the famous Cutter incident, where Cutter Laboratories, based in California, accidentally released a defective polio vaccine with a live version of the virus that caused about 40,000 children to develop polio, paralyzing 200 and killing 10, which obviously created a lot of support for the anti-vaccination movement. Needless to say, a lot of safeguards have been put in place since that happened, so this would never happen again. It has been 70 years at this point, but it is still often used as an example by anti-vaxxers of a time when medicine messed up. There was also the drama with the DPT vaccine in the mid-1970s and 80s after a London report was published that claimed that 36 children developed neurological conditions after getting the vaccine, which is for diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. You may know pertussis as whooping cough. And Brian Deer investigated this one, also legend. It was a complete unscientific mess. Shout out to Brian Deer for just always being around when we need him. But this led to a pseudoscientific TV documentary called DPT Vaccination Roulette, as well as a 1991 book called A Shot in the Dark. And the documentary centered around grieving parents that basically said the government mandated a vaccine that gave their children brain damage, which obviously it's going to strike a chord with a lot of people if they're seeing it on their TV while they're trying to eat dinner with their family. The documentary won numerous awards, but it was criticized by scientific and medical experts for using inaccurate statistics, unreliable experts, and questionable editing and narrative methods. In response, the 1986 National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act was passed, which created the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, often known as Vaccine Court, where people who feel that there's been an injury due to vaccination can go and get their cases tried, and it operates as a court, meaning that it requires a great deal of evidence to rule if injury has taken place, which is rarely possible because these are usually just anecdotal just so stories. The majority of the cases in vaccination court are settled without proof of causation to minimize time, expense, and risk of loss for both parties, and even then those numbers are incredibly low. It's around this time that the anti-vax movement starts to turn towards autism in response to the significant rise in the prevalence of autism. We'll talk about changes in prevalence rates in the autism section a little bit later, but there is a lot to explain why this is the case that has everything to do with social knowledge and diagnostic criteria and absolutely nothing to do with vaccines. This is where our friend thimerosal comes into the picture, and I start to bash my head into a wall. Basically, in the late 1990s, the EPA lowered the allowable amount of methylmercury exposure, given that mercury in higher levels can be a neurotoxin that can cause developmental disorders. Thimerosal, a mercury-based preservative used in some vaccines, then came into question by the US FDA, wondering if, even though the amounts of it used in vaccines were very small, it might be worth looking into just as an extra precaution. We now know that it was not a problem. There is no link between this and developmental disabilities, but at the time, the easy fix is just pull it from pretty much everything, which they did by 2001 in the US, EU, and many other countries. But this created a lot of distrust, partially because that wasn't reported on super well or super clearly, and there is a link between organic mercury and neurodevelopmental disorders, so it seemed a logical connection, even though the amounts are super different and it's a completely different compound. I should also mention that there's this environmental lawyer guy you may have heard of who appeared around this time. He's called Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and he was convinced that he uncovered a conspiracy between the CTC and Big Pharma and other people about knowing that thimerosal caused autism and trying to hide the information from the public, and then went on a big media tirade over that and published it in Rolling Stone, but I'm sure that he's irrelevant and won't come up later. Now, some reasons that we know that there's no relation between thimerosal and autism is the fact that autism rates continue to rise even after the removal of thimerosal from most vaccines, which statistically there would have been a decrease had that been a major cause. We also know the amount of mercury in vaccines is significantly smaller than the amount that is naturally occurring in most people, and anything that influences brain function can be toxic at certain levels that is really good and important for you, or that is at least completely neutral for you. It also, again, is a completely different elemental compound than elemental mercury and methylmercury are. Now, despite thimerosal not being in the vast majority of vaccines anymore, the Green Our Vaccine campaign used this as a stronghold for their protests and arguments to remove so-called toxins from vaccines. Other examples of this would be that they want formaldehyde removed and aluminum, because they're both listed as ingredients on the label, when aluminum in vaccines is usually a compound that is a salt, not the metal. Did you know that we already produce and have metals in our bodies and they're not bad for us? And also, we produce formaldehyde, and the amount of formaldehyde in vaccines is less than the amount that our bodies naturally produce by themselves. I understand why at face value, and we'll talk about this again later. These things look scary if you don't know anything about how science or chemicals work. And for a lot of people, learning more feels or is inaccessible to them because it is complicated and confusing, so they default to having other people explain it to them. And if they don't trust medical practitioners to do so, or they feel like if they ask about it, they're going to sound stupid, so they don't ask, they're going to get information that is just not accurate. Now, in 2008, there was a case heard at vaccine court of a little girl named Hannah Poling who had 5 vaccines in one day, which is fine, and was later diagnosed with encephalopathy and autistic-like symptoms in relation to a mitochondrial disorder. It was settled without proof of causation in vaccine court simply because there isn't a massive amount of research on vaccines and mitochondrial disorders, though it should be noted that the age of getting these particular vaccines is around the age that mitochondrial disorders are commonly diagnosed, so it is very likely just correlation. This is also a thing that will come up in the autism section a little bit bit later. This case is often used as the like, see, the court gave her family money because she got autism from the MMR, so the government admitted to it thing, which is fundamentally not what happened. There's also the famous omnibus autism proceedings that happened at vaccine court in June 2007. This was before the polling case, and they found that there was absolutely no link. Also 3 cases in March 2010 were also found to have no link. The omnibus one in particular, they thought that they had some data because there was a positive read of measles on somebody's tests or whatever, but that was ruled as lab contamination and not actually somebody having the disease in their body. The last thing on our little timeline is the 2016 Vaxxed situation, which I think was just kind of a mess all around. Basically, there was a new pseudoscientific vaccines are disabling our children film made that Wakefield was involved in, because of course he was. And it had a lot of doctored evidence and out of context quotations, and it was supposed to be screened at the Tribeca Film Festival, primarily because Robert De Niro has an autistic son, and so he lobbied to have it on the schedule. But after conversations with the medical community, he decided it was wise to remove it from the film festival, and anti-vaxxers took this to mean that censorship is alive and well, and they're trying to hide this film from us, and then it became a whole thing. It ended up being screened in like independent theaters across the United States and Europe. Vaxxed is still a very common hashtag used by anti-vaxxers to connect with one another. There's like this huge energy of like, treating this film as a martyr of sorts to rally behind. It's really strange, but I do think that the way that that whole situation was handled was also not great, so I sort of see why they took this and ran with it that way. But the next question for me is, why do people believe these things? Why do they want to believe these things? And why are they dying on these hills? And there are some obvious answers, and there are also some less obvious answers. The first is efficacy. The more people don't see diseases and the impacts the diseases have on people, the more they question the vaccines that prevent the diseases, because the risk-benefit ratio doesn't feel even because they can't see what the actual benefit of that thing is. If you had seen a lot of people have polio in front of you, you'd be more likely to probably want a polio vaccine so you wouldn't have to go through that. But if you've never seen that, you're just like, why am I putting this in my body? What's the point? The second argument is that there are just too many vaccines happening in such a short period of time, and so people feel like it's bound to make a child sick because their little immune systems aren't ready for that. But that's actually the precise reason that there are so many. Their little immune systems need the help to protect them from getting super sick with all of those things that they might really struggle with handling on their own. There's a reason the US infant mortality rate is down from 157.1 deaths per 1,000 live births in 1900 to about 7 per 1,000 at this point, primarily because of how low the rates of diphtheria, polio, pertussis, and measles are today. Vaccines also only make up a very tiny fraction of the pathogens a child is already naturally going to encounter in a typical year. Do you know how many things they shove into their mouths? Germs everywhere. Germs all over the place, and they need to be protected so that they can face all of those germs and not get super sick. It's also not just to protect them. A certain amount of vaccination needs to be reached to create herd immunity, meaning that people who are at higher risk of getting sick, like people who are too young to be vaccinated or who can't be vaccinated for various reasons, or people who are immunocompromised to a degree where their vaccine may no longer be super effective, like a sick or an elderly person, somebody with cancer maybe, or people for whom the vaccine didn't work, are going to be at risk if a high enough portion of the population is not vaccinated. I'll talk a little bit more about the play Eureka Day later in this video, but there was a parent in this show whose child was vaccinated with the MMR vaccine who had a play date with a child who wasn't and had mumps, and the vaccinated child got incredibly ill anyway and nearly died and lost his hearing in one of his ears. And hearing loss does not make somebody's life inherently worse. It's not the end of the world, but also being that sick is very traumatizing, and having a big change like that is very traumatizing, and that was completely and totally preventable. Some parents will opt for a more spread out vaccine schedule, but that typically does more harm than good, and there is no actual research as to why that would be helpful, because again, there is no data supporting vaccines causing any issues or developmental disability. Another argument is the freedom of religion thing and the claim that vaccines use cells from fetuses and abortion is bad, so therefore vaccines are bad. I'm so nervous about this video getting demonetized. I didn't even think about that until right now. The Children's Hospital of Philadelphia has a great article in the situation. I will link for you below if you want to read it, but a few things to note. First, many vaccines don't use those cells to begin with. Second of all, in order to grow a virus to use to inoculate somebody, it needs to grow in a cell, and certain kinds of cells can only do certain jobs. Fetal cells were found to be helpful for this because they are sterile and thus have not been introduced to any other diseases, and also because of how they function, they can be used longer. All fetal fibroblast and retinal cells used to create vaccines were collected from a total of 3 pregnancy terminations, 2 in the 1960s and 1 in 1985, and have been replicating by themselves since then. So nobody is making people end pregnancies in order to collect cells or whatever conspiracy theorists are saying. Also, the vaccines do not actually contain these cells at all. The cells die in the process, and then the virus itself is what is used in the vaccine. Also, religious leaders from the major religions, including Catholicism, have evaluated the use of these cells in making vaccines and determined that it is not sinful to accept vaccines made in this manner. The next argument is about liberty and freedom, which turns into the fact that apparently the government is hiding information from us, and Big Pharma funds all the research and makes money off of us being sick, and an overall mistrust. And the mistrust thing I hear, I think we can all say that the healthcare system as it currently stands maybe isn't the best situation, and in general the American population in particular does not particularly trust large corporations nor our government right now, but that is also not a reason to not do a well-documented safety measure. First of all, because the research on these things has been done across many countries with many different governments. Second of all, because research is not being primarily funded by Big Pharma. Third of all, because vaccines really aren't that lucrative of a thing for companies to make, and every time a controversy happens, a lot of companies just stop making those vaccines altogether because they don't want to deal with it, so it's not like they're making like crazy money off of it. I also think that there is a bad things happened in the past, so we don't trust this group of people now, like with the Cutter incident or like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. But it's not like those are things that the medical community is proud of having happened. They are things that we talk about regularly so that there is room to learn from mistakes and do better. And sure, there will always be the case of, wow, doctors were doing crazy stuff in the Victorian era and they were convinced it was the right thing that now we know really harmed people, so who's to say that that's not happening today? But then, what is the benefit to assuming that everybody's operating in bad faith? Like, yeah, science is flawed. It doesn't know everything. We're not gonna ever know everything. But why would that be a reason to discredit all of the things that we do know and we do have significant scientific evidence for that we continue to tweak and add to, because that is how the scientific process functions? And we saw a lot of this during the beginning of the COVID pandemic, where people assumed that since the science was changing, it meant that the governmental bodies were not to be trusted and were lying and they didn't know what was going on. So why should we trust them? When really, that's just the scientific method. We are continuously learning new information and we're continuously tweaking it to be more precise and more helpful. A lot of things that we've talked about here as reasons for anti-vaccine conspiracies are really just a confused misunderstanding that is likely often caused by unclear explanations. Like, for example, the fact that pregnant people who weren't vaccinated for measles as children shouldn't get the MMR vaccine while pregnant because it may pose a risk for the fetus. That does not mean that a vaccine would be harmful for a baby. It means that it might be harmful maybe for a fetus. And also, I should mention, a lot of the strict pregnancy recommendations primarily come from a place of, we don't entirely 100% know if it would be an issue and we can't really ethically test that, so maybe don't just in case if you can avoid it. Another thing a lot of people don't understand is the difference in elemental compounds that we talked about earlier, or the fact that big scary words I don't understand must mean that it's a big scary bad thing, or the fact that some children get rashes and fevers after vaccination, which makes parents worry that it's causing harm when that's actually precisely how it's supposed to work. I mean, we can tie that one all the way back to the smallpox vaccine, or the concept of peer review and the fact that most papers anti-vaxxers will cite as being legitimate proof of things are published in non-peer-reviewed open access journals that are not scientific at all or to be trusted. Or the fact that in science you can't ever actually prove the negative and say this does not cause this. You can only say there is no evidence that links this with this, which some people take to mean there is evidence that we have not yet found or we are not actively looking at. And when it comes to the autism situation in particular, other contributing factors to the myths and conspiracy theories surrounding the association between vaccines and autism include the fact that the diagnosis of autism is typically made after the age of receiving the main childhood immunizations, as well as the occasional occurrence of regression after the age of first-year vaccinations. Statistically, many autistic children have had the MMR vaccine because, statistically, many children are autistic, and also statistically many children get the MMR vaccine. But because of this myth that has been around a while, and the time of life where a child is often diagnosed as autistic because it is around the age that many different types of developmental delay become quite clear and is thus when the typical initial screening window is, people often just assume that there must be a correlation there, which is not how statistics works. There's also the question of the so-called autism epidemic. Researchers have explored possible reasons for the uptick, including rising parental ages and environmental triggers, but much of the increase, research suggests, stems from changes to diagnostic criteria, widespread awareness of the condition, and improvements in screening. Detection jumps have been particularly steep among children of color, girls, and young adults, all of whom have historically been diagnosed less frequently. I think it's important to remember that autism did not exist as its own discrete condition until the 1940s, and of course we're going to see an increase in it over time. We are still learning what it is and how it functions. A lot of the root concern around autism and vaccines is caught up in the fact that we don't actually know what definitively causes autism, so you can't be like, the vaccine doesn't cause autism, this does, because we don't know what the this is. It's generally agreed upon as being probably primarily genetic. It also seems correlated with prenatal illness, premature birth, and paternal age. It also appears to be developed when a child is in the womb. It's not like a latent onset situation, but to people looking for concrete answers as to why their child is disabled, even a retracted study giving them a precise cause that also ties them to a community of other grieving parents who are angry about something probably feels better to them, which is not the fault of the medical community. That's just kind of the way that things are, and that the comforting narratives are sometimes the wrong ones. I do wish that diagnostic programs offered immediate connection upon diagnosis with other parents of kids with similar diagnoses and adults who have those diagnoses so that parents immediately have a solid support system. I think that would do people a lot of good and probably prevent a lot of this, but I digress. Having somebody to blame or having something to blame makes it easier easier to cope with a diagnosis. Also, in the realm of cause, it's important to note that for much of autism's early history, it was believed that autism was caused by a so-called refrigerator mother. This is also an idea that is still alive and well in many other countries and cultures today, saying that a child is autistic because the parents didn't love their child enough or care for them enough, and so it's the parents' fault that the child is this way. And I can't help but wonder how much of this need to find an external thing to blame for it is rooted in this "it might be my fault" feeling, or this "I'm embarrassed that my child is like this" feeling, when that's not the case, and we factually know that it isn't. It's just the social stigma that makes some people feel like it might be. I should also note that autism is not a death sentence. It is not the worst thing in the world. Like, yeah, disability can suck sometimes, and we don't have enough supports for disabled folks. That is all correct. But there has always been such a huge undercurrent of ableism and paternalism around developmental disability and in the anti-vaccine movement that really bothers me. And then often the pro-vaccine side will accidentally also say ableist things and trying to spread the proper information about vaccines. So it's just a whole ableist mess, and nobody really talks about that aspect of it because that's not the primary concern, but it is definitely a concern, and it should be pointed out. The other thing that I don't think is talked about enough is the fact that the rise in the vaccines cause autism myth has caused a huge uptick in people trying to market quack preventatives and cures for autism that regularly poison people and cause permanent damage, and that's very upsetting and very disheartening to see. I sort of want to make a video at some point about like various autism curing hoaxes in history, but I'm nervous it'll either be too dark for you all or too dark for me, so haven't gotten there. But if you want to know about that, let me know and I will dip my toe into that adventure. But anyway, I'm not saying all of this to call anybody unintelligent, not that intelligence is a marker of worth either, but you know what I mean here. A lot of this mindset comes from people thinking emotionally before thinking factually, which is kind of just human nature. And also, the facts that they think that they know are usually related to miscommunication, which is often taken by people who know that it's miscommunication and then weaponized for political gain. Which brings us to the, oh no, this is politically relevant again, and that's why I'm making this section of the video. When asked in an interview for Time's 2024 Person of the Year whether he would approve of an end to childhood vaccination programs, Trump said he would have a big discussion with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the vaccine skeptic he has tapped to run the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. The autism rate is at a level that nobody ever believed possible, Trump continued. If you look at things that are happening, there's something causing it. Well, we know what it is. We just talked about it. There was also an online event in May of 2020 where Wakefield and RFK Jr. talked about conspiracy theories around vaccines and how the pandemic was a way for the government to force mandatory vaccinations on its people. Which, and maybe I'm just a bad conspiracy theorist, I have been racking my brain trying to figure out what the government would actually gain from that for like a very long time. Like, the vaccine rollout was so visibly stressful, laborious, complicated, and expensive for the government to do, so I'm not sure what benefit they would actually get from forcefully vaccinating everyone beyond the benefit that they're telling us is the benefit. Don't give me your theories in the comments because I don't want them, but I'm just genuinely quite baffled about it. But what's interesting politically is that countries in which the highest proportion of the electorate vote is for populist parties also have the highest levels of vaccine skepticism. Populists argue that elites and experts work together to pursue their own interests, even when they harm the interests of ordinary people. And so this fits in pretty well with the idea of anti-vaxxers and vaccine skeptics. Populism is a movement that primarily relies on simple messages and fear to gain popularity and power. And anti-vaccination rhetoric, the idea of a government conspiracy that this leader could protect you from, that works very strongly in their favor, and very negatively in the favor of actual ordinary people who are now fighting about a thing that does not need to be fought about, which diverts their energy from organizing for things that we should be fighting about, that everybody wants to have better, like better healthcare. The World Health Organization has labeled vaccine hesitancy as a top 10 threat to global health. Tens of thousands of preventable deaths are happening every year because of it, particularly with the flu, but also with chickenpox, measles, and whooping cough. Not just for people who are unvaccinated, but also primarily those who rely on herd immunity to keep them safe. Measles specifically was declared eliminated completely in the United States in 2000, and now we have several outbreaks of it every year. Going back to the Play Eureka Day, there were two parents who felt like vaccination was not the move for their child. One who had a child, this is a spoiler by the way, if you want to skip the spoiler, go to this time code. They're up until February 2nd, so if this is out before then go see it. Anyway, one of them had a child suddenly die and decided on her own that since she thought it correlated to the time of her child's vaccinations, that was the cause, and thus became an anti-vaxxer to try to control her grief. Another one was struggling with how much science didn't know, and thus why should we trust that what they're saying now is correct because they've gotten things wrong before. And the first parent, they were not able to change her mind, and so she and her children ended up leaving the school, but the second one said something along the lines of, what story do I want to tell my children? That there's a giant conspiracy to hurt all of us, or that people are genuinely trying their best and sometimes they make mistakes, but they're always working to do better? Because I believe that's how people truly are, and I want my children to believe that about humanity too. Which just really stuck out to me. And while maybe it wasn't my favorite thing to think I was getting a break from work and then fully not getting that, there was something about seeing the emotionality of this conversation and being in a room with that that really helped me to understand why people want to believe a certain narrative over another one. The emotions around I want to protect my baby and that's my job as a parent are strong ones that can be wielded in many different directions. And I think it's so easy to look at the vaccine conversation as a thing on a page or a TV screen and go, those people are stupid, those people are crazy, they actively want to harm their child. When in reality, they feel like they aren't. Does that mean that's what's happening? Absolutely not. They're totally harming their child and everybody who's ever around their child. But the idea that everybody with a certain mindset is crazy and can never change their minds about something if approached properly in a way that makes them feel heard and seen and smart and valued, that's not a particularly helpful way to go about things like that. I mean, no, not everybody is going to be able to change their minds, but not everybody is immediately a lost cause and an active danger if they believe in misinformation. So I think the next question, right, is what can we do about this? Even when I talk about truly miserable topics on this channel, I try to end them with a note of like, here's what you can control. I don't have a lot for you specifically, but more general things. We need to help instill trust in healthcare providers. We now know that scientific misinformation needs to be dealt with swiftly and clearly, especially on social media because of how easily it spirals out of control. We also know that punishing dissenters can fuel conspiracies, so things need to instead be fought with proof and scientific argument that is presented in plain and clear language. There needs to be proper enforcement of public health policies. There's also more need than ever to work on media literacy and critical thinking skills and on realizing that certain stories are being told because fear sells well, not because they are entirely true. Media tends to, in general, not be super great with handling medical things unless they have an active, like, medical professional who's talking to you. Critical thinking in reading and understanding research is also incredibly important, and generally understanding the scientific method and how things grow and change and how there is no evidence of functionally means it doesn't exist, in the same way that theory does not actually mean scientists pulled it out of nowhere and it's a random guess. There's actually a lot of evidence towards it. Also, you now know the scientific data and the emotions behind this conversation, which you probably didn't know before this video, unless you watched the H-Bomber guy video from some years ago that I found after I finished writing the script. Whoopsies, I didn't watch it. But next time somebody talks to you about feeling otherwise, maybe you can have a more constructive conversation about it. And if you're thinking to yourself, I don't know any anti-vaxxers. How would I know any anti-vaxxers? You definitely do. I dated one once and I didn't know until like 2 months in because they were too embarrassed to tell me. And also, what a choice to just date a disabled person as an anti-vaxxer. It didn't go well, if you're wondering. But anyway, to some degree, anti-vaccine conspiracy theories are always going to exist. They are always going to have a bit of a strong base because people want to have something to blame their often unexplainable hardship on. And in a world where the social contract is broken down and we feel like the people who are supposed to represent us don't, there's going to be a lot more distrust and confusion and fear. This all makes sense and these emotions are incredibly valid. They're just being channeled in a very harmful direction. And that is hard. And it's scary to know that some of these people are in power now and are deliberately in charge of some sections of our medical systems. It does seem like most people expect that it would be nearly impossible for them to pull FDA approval of vaccines, or if they figured out how to do that, the courts would lock that down pretty quickly. So while we can be nervous about vaccine policies getting looser, there is little to no chance of losing access to vaccines, and I'm going to hold on to that very, very strongly. He will probably spread a lot of misinformation and try to, if not succeed, in changing recommendations and conversations around things, and there is concern that that could lead to a return of measles and whooping cough, which I feel less good about. But that's just what it is right now, and I have to trust that medical people are doing the best they can, and they're gonna continue to try to do the best that they can, and it is what it is. Because I think there is genuine and real concern about what the next 4 years are going to look like for the US in general. I'm right there with you, but for me, I'm trying to look at it as like, all right, my job just got a little bit harder and I'm gonna just keep on doing it because it needs to be done. The fear mongering about it's not really helping us be more prepared for things. It's just kind of making us panic, which, as we saw today from the other side, maybe isn't the most healthy or helpful thing when it comes to critical thinking, or making good decisions or preparing for things. I don't know if that point of view is comforting to you at all or not right now, but it is the one that I have to share. In the meantime, the number one thing you yourself can do to protect yourself and your community, make sure that you're up to date on your vaccines, get your flu shot. Please do that. Get your COVID boosters. Please do that. Wear a mask, wash your hands, wear a mask. I'm saying it again. Take care of yourself in general so that you don't get sick. And as always, thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember, critical thinking is really sexy. And I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.